This is Gareth Aden of the Historical Committee of the Nashville Bar Association, and it's my privilege to be here today as a part of the Oral History Project and interviewing one of Nashville's well-known and well-liked attorneys, Jere Lee. Good afternoon, Jere.
Thank you. Good to be here, especially with you.
Agreed. What is your full name, please, sir?
Jere Robert Lee.
And were you born here in Nashville?
I was.
And what date, please, sir?
July 17th, 1954.
For a minute, let's talk about your family and tell us a little bit about your father and where he was from and grew up, and then about your mother also.
My father's family grew up in Dixon County. They were primarily in the mom and pop motel business down there, and they expanded their business up to the Nashville area. And my mother's family is from Giles County. She grew up in Wales, Tennessee, outside of Pulaski.
You know, there's something I wanted to ask you about your mom that you and I have discussed previously. As I understand it, she had a college education.
She did, which was really unusual for a woman her age. She was born in 1920, and she had a degree from Martin College in Pulaski. And what's even more amazing is her mother had a degree from Martin College, which, if you think about how far back that goes, it was really most unusual, I think, for that time, particularly in the South.
Now, you and your mom and dad and brother did not grow up in Belmead or Green Hills, correct?
No, I grew up on Lebanon Road between Spence Lane and Fessler's Lane. At a mom and pop motel that my folks ran right there at the top of the hill as you come up past Mount Olivet Cemetery.
And did you actually live at the motel?
We did. It was a 12-room motel, and residence was built onto the structure. And once my brother and I got a little older and were fighting, we had to expand a little bit, so we just knocked a door through the first room, and that became our bedroom from that time going forward.
Did your dad also have a service station business?
He did. He was a mechanic by and large. He had a number of different jobs, but he ran the service station next door, so we sort of had the market cornered there in that little area. If your car broke down, you needed a place to stay, we could take care of both things.
Tell me a bit about the remainder of your family. I think you have an older brother, is that correct?
He's a lot older. He's 7 years older. I'm always offended when people have to ask who's the older brother. David is an emergency physician at Baptist on Church Street. And also, I think, still works a shift or two every now and then in Murfreesboro with a hospital they're affiliated with down there.
Let's turn for just a minute to your childhood. Did you grow up primarily just in the neighborhood there on Lebanon Road and playing?
I did. Most of my playmates lived in the trailer park next door. Went to Margaret Allen Elementary School on Spence Lane. Could have walked to school, was zoned to walk, but my mother insisted on driving me and picking me up because she was devoted to both of us, and that was something she wanted done, so that's the way we did it.
Is Margaret Allen Elementary still operating today?
The building is still there, and I believe it's an elementary school, but I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Any teachers that are outstanding or events outstanding from your first 6 years in school?
I remember in particular a second grade teacher, Ms. Jackson. I don't remember anything in particular about her other than she seemed special at the time. Other than that, I guess the only other memory I have is being in the 4th grade the day that President Kennedy was shot, and everybody watching it on television. I remember, that was duck and cover days, and we would have forms to take home about in the event of a nuclear holocaust. Did we want to be released to go on the bus, or did we want to have our parents pick us up? Silly things like that.
You know, think that you mentioned there's a good mutual friend of yours and mine that you went to school with during that period.
Scott Derrick and I became friends, I think, in the 4th grade, about that time. He lived on Lebanon Road, further out toward Donaldson than where I was, and we've been friends ever since.
We'll come back to that in a little while, but let me ask you this, and the reason I'd ask you about your mom and her education, did she have an impact on your education?
She did, in many ways. My parents divorced about the time I was a high school senior, and she had clearly made a pact with herself that she was going to stay with my dad long enough to get me into college. And by the time I was a senior in high school, we had friends who had older brothers in Knoxville, and several of us had spent weekends in Knoxville, and I was just convinced that I needed to go to UT and spend my time up there with my friends when I went to college, and my mother insisted instead that I go to Vanderbilt.
Had she insisted over the years in both elementary and high school that you study?
You know, I don't ever remember having anybody push us. I think probably, I hate to admit this, but my brother was interested in being a doctor. In fact, by the time I was in high school, he was in medical school. And I think I sort of decided I wanted to keep up with my brother, and he did well. And so I just sort of took to it naturally, I think. But my mother decided that I needed to go to Vanderbilt.
Before that, tell us a little bit about where you went to school after you got out of elementary school. My mother, again, got me an exception to go out of zone from where I lived. I wasn't zoned to go to high school and junior high at Two Rivers, but she had, I assume with the help of people like Ms. Jackson, intervened on my behalf and allowed me to go to Two Rivers, and ended up going there for 5 years. Would have graduated from Two Rivers, but it was 1972, and McGavock was open, and the comprehensive high school and combined Donaldson High School, Two Rivers High School, and Cameron all into one big school, and that was the first year we had busing here in town. And I ended up going to McGavock my senior year and graduating from McGavock in the first class. What was the experience like going to high school that senior year with a new program of busing coming into town? I think people might be interested in knowing.
It was a very volatile experience. The teachers were, as long as we weren't fighting, there was a lot of tension, racial tension, and as long as we weren't fighting, they didn't really care whether we went to school or not. So we spent a lot of time at Percy Priest Lake my senior year. I don't mean to suggest that there was bloodshed in the halls. It's just that everybody had to get adjusted. And some of the teachers I had then were very good about helping with that, and student government associations and things like that. Looking back on it, you know, I think there was a lot of potential there that was wasted that year, but it was probably necessary that that be done in order to get everybody used to each other and to getting along and focusing on learning, which I hope came later after I graduated.
Scholastically, how did you do in high school?
I wasn't valedictorian. I'm sure I was in the top 10% of the class, but as I said, I had good enough grades to get into Vanderbilt, and that was about as high as I wanted to aspire anyway, so it worked out okay for me.
You mentioned already that your mother was pretty insistent that you go to Vanderbilt rather than your preference for UT. Am I right about that?
She was, yes, she was. She was very insistent. I was thinking more about social life, and she was thinking more about education, I think.
During your summer times there as a junior and senior in high school, what did you do?
Scott, whom I mentioned earlier, and I had a good friend whose father owned a construction company. And I don't know if it's still the case. I don't have any young boys or young men in my family, but at least at that time, in the summertime, you wanted to make a little money to put in the gas tank. And if you could build your muscles up and get a tan at the same time, it didn't hurt. So doing construction work was the thing to do. And my friend Mike and his dad would generally find some ditches for us to dig or something like that. And so that's primarily what we did. And that I also worked some in a drive-in market as a cashier. That was something my father was doing at the time, and he had his employer was willing to try me out as well, and so I did some of that too.
Right. Now we come to that fascinating passage where I guess we're in about the fall of 1972, and you're becoming a student at Vanderbilt. Mm-hmm. What was that like? What was the campus like, the students, what was happening?
I really wish I could tell you. I missed out on a lot of that because I didn't live on campus for my freshman year, and I didn't move onto campus until like the last month of my sophomore year. So I was very much a townie, would drive out and go to class, and then come home and do what needed doing. At that time, I said was still living at the motel with my mother. And by that time, she and my father were divorced, and she was running the motel by herself. So I tried to be there with her some and help her.
How about your grades in your first and second years?
I don't know that I set the world on fire. I managed to determine what I was good at and what I enjoyed. And strangely enough, what I wasn't very good at, I didn't enjoy. I quickly learned that social sciences were much more conducive, I guess, to my way of thinking and studying. And if there was an exact answer, I didn't do so well. But if I could BS my way through some stuff and discuss the issues on both sides, I could generally do better. So I'd gravitated toward social sciences, and political science in particular ended up being my major. Again, I think that was great for training for being a lawyer. We're supposed to be able to take both sides. In order to be a really effective advocate, you have to understand the other side's arguments in order to deconstruct them. And I think that's what led me into the law.
What about is there anything that you can sort of recall of interest about the social context of the campus? This is sort of known as a period in the late 60s and early 70s of a lot of change was there.
Yeah, I think probably this was early 70s. I guess most of the change and stuff had occurred. So I was a little bit on the back end of most of the social upheaval in the 60s, but I think Vanderbilt probably was one of the few universities where the faculty was more liberal than the students at that time. But in my day, in my class, we took great pride, rightly or wrongly, in the belief that we had the lowest Greek participation in the history of the university. We were all GDIs, or goddamn independents, as we liked to say at the time. So again, I was sort of on, in many ways, on the outside looking in at what was actually happening on campus until my junior and senior year. And then I finally went back to my mother and convinced her I was losing out on part of the experience, and we needed to come up with some additional money so that I could live on campus. And that's what I ended up doing my last 2 years.
Where did you live?
Well, in order to qualify for the lottery, I had to live on campus at the end of my sophomore year, and some poor freshman had flunked out or gone home, and they put me in the freshman dorm for about 6 weeks. And then once I qualified for the lottery, I had the high privilege and honor of qualifying to live in Barnard, which was a dump even then. I'm not even sure it still exists. It was a dump in 1974. And then I finally got lucky my senior year and ended up in a two-bedroom townhome development called Chafin Place out across from the VA hospital.
Right.
It used to be next to the athletic fields, but now those athletic fields are the largest parking garage in Middle Tennessee, from what I understand. They're adjacent to what used to be the international housing,
Exactly.
or the towers out there across the street, across 24th.
Morgan and Lewis House.
Morgan and Lewis, that's exactly right.
Yes, I remember that well.
And Chafin was a really nice place.
Now, Jere, I think that in the course of your studies there at Vanderbilt, there was a particular class in political science that sort of led to an interest that may have led to your law practice. Can you tell us anything about that?
Well, I don't remember a particular class, other than there was one in constitutional law, which was, as they made clear to tell you from the beginning, was about the political end of it and not the law. But it was taught by the guy who happened to be the pre-law advisor, so kind of told you that with a wink and a nod. That was Dr. Birkby, and he became my advisor. Again, I think political science and trying to see things from the other guy's perspective sort of pushed me in the direction of law school. That and the fact that, as I told you, my brother was studying to be a doctor, and being a lawyer seemed like the next best thing. Please don't tell him I said that, but it was sort of the next highest profession without following exactly in his footsteps, which I would not allow myself to do.
I was going to say, he might agree with you on that point. A couple of things. Number one, I think, if I remember correctly, that you and Scott continued to work construction during the summer times in college.
We did. I'm trying to remember exactly when. I know we were doing construction work during the Watergate hearings because I'd come home. I think he was working at unloading freight, I think, or something. So he was working during an evening shift, and he'd stay home and watch the hearings. I'd go do the construction work. I'd come in, we'd pass. He'd tell me what had happened, and then he'd go to work. But I think that's probably right.
Did you become involved in the political end of things anytime during your undergraduate school?
Yes and no. My last semester of my senior year, I applied for some sort of internship that allowed me to spend all of my time as an intern at the General Assembly. If you've been reading the paper, you know that they've recently gotten into a little trouble with the interns, and they've barred them now from going to any of the receptions. Well, I can't imagine what interns are learning if they're not going to the receptions. That's where you learned everything. But I spent my entire last semester of my senior year as an intern in the office of the Speaker of the House. And I would attend committee hearings, and at times I would take the votes in the committee hearings. And the biggest thrill was when there were actual live hearings, when the legislature was actually in session. The speaker would be behind me, and I'd be working the board in terms of turning on the microphones. And I quickly learned, just because somebody stood up and raised their hand, that did not mean that I turned on their microphone. I waited until the speaker told me whose microphone he wanted turned on.
For the record, am I correct that Speaker of the House of Representatives for Tennessee later became governor?
He did all right by himself. It was Ned Ray McWhirter, and he was just the speaker at that time. The clerk was a fellow named Jim Free, and Jim hired me, and so I got to know him. And as I said, part of what you learned was what happened after the session. And it always amazed me to come home in the morning and read the newspaper, and I'd read that and say, well, that's not what happened. I was there. I went to dinner with them later. That's not how it went down. So I can't imagine them borrowing interns from receptions now.
What was it like to sort of get to know and work with the later Governor McWhorter?
He was quite an interesting figure. Really, really likable man, huge man, overpowering physical presence, but soft-spoken and willing to sit down and listen and help people. He was very helpful to me. I learned to like and respect him a great deal. He went, as I said, went to dinner meetings with him and other representatives and watched him twist arms in his own way and watched how the legislative process worked, aside from what you see when the cameras are rolling.
Did that work in the General Assembly and with Governor McWhorter sort of lead on to other things that you did in Tennessee political life?
It did. Strangely enough, by the time my senior year was over and I had graduated, that session of the legislature had run beyond Vanderbilt's graduation. And so I was still employed, but by that time Jim Free, the clerk who had hired me, had been tapped by Jimmy Carter to be Carter's Tennessee campaign manager. I got to sit in on the meeting where that was negotiated. And so I ended up, strangely enough, once the legislature was no longer in session and Vanderbilt was no longer holding classes, I ended up working a little bit at the Carter headquarters. Then later that summer, Speaker McWhorter asked me if there's anything he could do for me, and I said, well, I really would like a nice construction job that pays a little more. In those days, you got maybe $2.50 an hour driving a truck, unless you were on a federal job or something like that, which would pay more. So he got me a construction job building the Performing Arts Center. And I did that for a couple of months that summer.
Well, I had noticed a dent in the building over there, and maybe that was the part that you put in.
Well, I had my share of screw-ups, I can tell you that. Digging ditches and installing sewer lines in apartment complexes, which is what I had done before, is a little different from putting up a 15, 16-story high-rise.
Let's take up now with sort of your senior year at Vanderbilt. I think what was your major, actually?
Political science.
Okay. And I'm sure you began thinking about what you were going to do after graduation. And tell us a little bit about that and what happened.
Well, I wanted to go to law school. I don't specifically remember why or when. I just seemed like I always knew I wanted to go to law school. And so by that time, I was trying to get into the best law school I could get into. Once again, Speaker McWhorter asked if there was anything he could do, and I suggested that if he happened to know anybody on the Board of Trust that he could whisper in their ear on my behalf, it would certainly prove helpful. And he said, well, I'll talk to Senator Motlow about that. And at some point, I'm going to say it must have been late July, I finally got a letter of acceptance from Vanderbilt. So I got accepted maybe 6 weeks before classes started. And prior to that, I had already decided I was going to get married and was going to stay here in town and try to get into Vanderbilt the following year if I didn't get in this year. So that came in, worked out very well.
Well, that leads to exactly where I was going.
Good.
Before we go on with your career, I think there was a young lady that you had met when you first went to Vanderbilt.
If nothing else, my mother got that right. I met my wife, Yvonne, in German class when I was a freshman at Vanderbilt. I can't think of anything else good I got out of German class. I ended up taking another semester of German and basically flunking out because if you didn't complete 2 semesters, you didn't get credit for the first one. So I never completed that second one. I decided to satisfy my distribution requirements some other way. But I did get a wife out of the deal, and I had decided that I needed to not let her get away, and although our original agreement was we would both get into and go to the best graduate schools we could get in. She had already been accepted to psychology graduate school at Vanderbilt, and I had not gotten into law school, but we decided we'd go ahead and get married anyway. And then roughly a month after we made the decision, and maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the marriage occurred, I got that letter saying I had been accepted. Thanks, I'm sure in no small part to Speaker McWhorter.
Well, that means the summer of 1976 was an important summer in your life. You got married and you got accepted to Vanderbilt.
Very much so, yes, it was.
Now tell us, before we go on to other things, about Yvonne. What was her maiden name and where had she grown up?
Her maiden name is Batey, B-A-T-E-Y. She grew up in Nashville. Her father was a professor of New Testament studies, and I guess the time she was probably 2nd grade, something like that, he took a sabbatical and went to Germany, and they lived in Germany for a year, and then when they came back, he took a position, I believe, with Harding Academy in Memphis. And she lived in Memphis from that time until she came back up here to Vanderbilt her freshman year.
We'll come back and we'll talk more about your family in a
Sure.
moment, but let's sort of continue the chronology of your career. How did you find Vanderbilt Law School? Give us your recollections there.
It sounds corny, but I found it really exciting to be around so many bright people. It's not like everybody when I was an undergraduate was an idiot, but it was, looking back on it now, it was just interesting to be around so many different people from different parts of the country with different points of view, and different way of seeing things, different ways of reasoning through problems. And again, it sounds corny, but it was very stimulating.
My guess is that going to Vanderbilt here in Nashville, that you got to know in law school and probably be a classmate of some other students who ended up practicing here.
You asked me that the other day, and I was surprised I couldn't think of more. Obviously, Joe Gibbs and Tom Trent. I think Joe was somebody I met the first day at the library, and Tom, and then Pete Ezell, Nail Falls, and I'm sure there are others, and I apologize for not thinking of them, but those are the ones that come immediately to mind.
Was law school what you had expected it to be?
Yes and no. I don't know what my expectations were. I do remember that there was a movie out about that point in time, either Love Story or The Paper Chase, or both of them, in which the contracts professor got a guy up on his feet and deliberately embarrassed him and he wasn't prepared, and called him up to the podium and handed him a dime, which would have been a quarter now, we don't even have pay phones anymore. At that time, handed him a dime and said, "Here's a dime, go call your mother and tell her there's serious doubt whether you'll ever be a lawyer." And we had a guy, it was like that was a tradition. Every law school had to have one professor who did that. And I had one who did that. He didn't do that to me, but he did that to a fellow in my class. And that's just part of teaching, hazing, whatever, that I've never really thought very highly of. I know it goes on in a lot of professions. My youngest daughter's in medical school now, and they've got a professor who does the same thing. And I just don't know how productive that is. But yes, we had that guy. And then I had Dean Wade was there. He was sort of the number one expert in the country on torts. I managed to take an advanced class from him. Appreciated that. On the whole, I was very pleased with Vanderbilt and the education I got there.
Did you know going into law school any areas that you were interested in practicing in?
I really didn't. Frankly, looking back on it, probably what I was thinking in the back of my mind was I might want to do something political, and a lot of political people have a law background. And that makes it sound like I never intended to practice, which is inaccurate. I don't know at what point it became obvious to me that that's what I was going to do. I guess I saw a little bit of the political end when I was at the General Assembly. I had an opportunity to go to Washington after Carter had won, and at that point I had seen a little of what they call Potomac fever, and how it gets a hold of people and it just takes over their lives. And I was a little scared by that. So I turned down that opportunity and decided I was going to focus on going to law school and practicing law instead.
When you finished your first year at Jere, what did you do during the summer? Did you get a job?
I think the first year after that, I went out and did construction work again. If you ever are out on I-24 headed toward Clarksville, right out here between Old Hickory Boulevard and Whites Creek Pike. Whatever contractor had won the right to do that had done a horrible job, and I was on a crew that basically repaved all of that stretch of Interstate 24, and that's what I spent my summer doing. Basically measuring the depth of the gravel that was poured before the machine came along and turned it into concrete.
Vital knowledge for lawyers.
That's right. That's right. Well, I learned to argue with hard-headed people. There's few people are more hard-headed than the foreman of a construction crew.
While you were in law school, I know you were married, but did you have an opportunity to work in a law environment at all while you were going to Vanderbilt?
I did. First worked for the district attorney's office as a clerk when Tom Shriver was still district attorney, and Torrey Johnson was wet behind the ears. He'd just been practicing a couple of years when I got there. Got to know a lot of the guys who were DAs right up until a few years ago. The people that were with Shriver at that time in the mid to late 70s basically populated the office until 20, 25 years ago. So I had a relationship. I don't know how professional it was. I was a clerk, they were lawyers, but at least they knew who I was and I knew who they were by first names. Enjoyed doing that, and it got me a little time to hang out in the courthouse and sit in the back of the room and get a flavor for how things worked in the courthouse.
After your second year at law school, I think you told me you went out of town.
I did. At that point, I decided I was going to practice somewhere, and I needed to decide where. And I felt like maybe I had cheated myself because I had grown up in Nashville, and I went to high school in Nashville, I went to college in Nashville. Maybe I ought to go somewhere else and see what it was like. So I interviewed with a number of places and ended up taking a job with a really nice firm, good people, down in Fort Lauderdale. And Yvonne and I ended up spending our summer in Fort Lauderdale before my senior year.
Eventually, after you graduated from law school, did that firm make an offer to you?
They did. I had an offer from that firm, which I appreciated, and an offer from a Chattanooga firm, and an offer from a firm here in Nashville.
And what firm was that, please, sir?
Dodson, Harris, Robinson, and Aden. That's what it was called at that time.
I remember that well, and I think that you accepted our job here in Nashville and worked in that firm for, what, about 7 or 8 years?
I did, for about 8 years. That's correct. Got a chance to work with Mr. Harris, which, looking back on it now, I wish I could have made more of that than I did. It was a wonderful opportunity. It's the kind of thing you don't necessarily appreciate till you have a little hindsight. And got to meet you and worked with Mr. Dodson and with Tyree and Harlan and Mac Robinson. And, it was a fine group of people.
Well, I can remember well trying a number of lawsuits with you, and it was a great period of time. In the meantime, while you were graduating from law school, had Yvonne also graduated from her studies?
She did. I always give her grief. It only took me 3 years to get to my doctorate, and it took her 4. But she eventually got her PhD in developmental psychology and has had various positions at Vanderbilt ever since then, and he is currently a professor at the medical school. She doesn't do as much teaching as she once did. I think her teaching primarily was teaching young doctors to appreciate developmental milestones in young children. You know, when you're this age, how many words should you put together in a sentence? Or physically, what should you be able to do at this age? So if some child is delayed, you pick it up as quickly as possible and send them to the right people to help their development. More recently, she's been involved in research and grant writing for research, particularly related to autism. She's with the Kennedy Center now.
Well, I know she's had an outstanding career at Vanderbilt and is well known in that community and throughout Nashville, and that's been wonderful. I want to ask you now about something that, because I know you well, I know it's very important to you. Tell us about the family that you and Yvonne had, the children you've had, and what they've done and where they are now.
I have 3 beautiful daughters. Rachel was born in 1983. She's married to Kurt, and Kurt is a legislative liaison between the General Assembly and he's going to have to forgive me. They changed the name of the department that he represents to make it more politically correct every few years. But it's like mental health and mental services. And I think his function is to get whatever legislation his commissioner feels like needs written and get it passed and get their budgets funded. From what I hear, Kurt is one of the top people doing what he does. Rachel's very lucky to have him, and so are Yvonne and I.
Now, Rachel was born in 1983?
Yes, she's the oldest.
She's your oldest. And where did she go to school?
Well, one of the best things we ever did, the second best thing I ever did, was buy a house on Barton Avenue. Marrying Yvonne was the first thing. The second thing, buying this house allows us to be a block from Aden Elementary. So all the kids were able to walk around the corner and be at school. Rachel went to Aden, and then she went to J.T. Moore, and then graduated from Hillsborough High School. And she ended up going to Rhodes College, which is where my father-in-law was teaching at the time, in Memphis. And she graduated in 3 years and has come back and was a school teacher for several years, and just recently had her first child. Amory her child is just over a year now, and Rachel is basically a stay-at-home mom at the present time. And my second child, Nicole, was born in '85. She also went to Aden, obviously. She went to J.T. Moore, and she went to Hillsborough. She graduated as valedictorian at Hillsborough. She went to Vanderbilt, and then has basically, it's a nurse practitioner, which, if I understand correctly, is essentially the same as a PhD in nursing, not to be confused with a physician's assistant. But she is a nurse practitioner and works with Dr. Mackey, who's a well-known spine surgeon here in town with Tennessee Orthopedic.
I believe that she kind of dovetailed with one of your great hobbies of Vanderbilt baseball and married a baseball player.
Well, she made it a great hobby. She, very on in her freshman year, sort of like Yvonne and I, she met a young man named Tyler Roden, and they've been together ever since. Tyler ended up, or he was here because Coach Corbin had offered him a scholarship to come and pitch, and he was a pitcher for 4 years for Vanderbilt, was the winning pitcher in the only conference championship game we have won in the Corbin era. And then he wanted to pursue his dream of baseball, and so Nicole gave him a little time, and for 2 or 3 years he hopped around playing minor league ball, and I think he quickly found it was very different from what he had hoped, and he has since decided he can do better and working for, what did I tell you? The company he works for, Medtronics.
Medtronics here in Nashville.
Yeah, he works for Medtronics here in Nashville, and they're doing very well. They have one child, Caroline, who is just over 2 years old, and they are expecting their second child in June, and have recently done us the honor of buying the house next door to us, are in the middle of extensive renovations. So we'll have 2 grandchildren right next door, and Nicole will be happy, and her kids can go to the same elementary school she went to and walk around the corner. So,
well, knowing you, you'll be happy too.
I'll be happy too, and it'll be nice to have them next door, and they'll be of support to Yvonne, I'm sure.
Right. Now tell us about your youngest daughter.
Katie was born in 1990. She also went to Aden. She ended up, by that time the zoning had changed, and instead of going to Moore, she went to West End Junior High. And then she went to Hillsborough. And she went to Vanderbilt for 4 years, and then decided she wanted to go to be a doctor. So she's in medical school at East Tennessee State in Johnson City, and is about a little over halfway through her second year in medical school.
Has Katie decided what area of medicine?
Oh, sure. She'll be quick to tell you she wants to go into pediatrics. It's really burns her up every time she mentions that to anybody who knows anything about the medical profession. They immediately tell her that, well, you know, that's the lowest paying specialty. And it makes her angry because she's not interested in making money. It's what she wants to do. So she wants to go into pediatrics.
And I understand that Katie is quite a young lady of the modern era.
She is. She's had a little difficulty adapting to the culture in East Tennessee. It's not quite as progressive as she would like. And she's doing everything she can, within her power, while doing well in medical school, to turn things around in East Tennessee.
Jere, let's now, after the joy of hearing about your beautiful family, let's go back and talk about your last 30-odd years in practice. I think you've been largely a sole practitioner after our old firm dissolved.
It was 28 years, from 87 to 15, yes. I was a sole practitioner.
And what type of practice did you develop, and sort of tell us how that went?
Well, as anybody who's ever done a sole practice will tell you, it develops with what will pay the bills. And I was lucky enough, because of my connections with Dodson, Harris, Robinson, and Aden, to have some clients that I took with me and some interests that I had developed as a result of working there, primarily starting with what used to be called the Tennessee Public Service Commission, that regulated, at least as far as I was concerned, motor carrier traffic here in the state. In the old days, if you wanted to haul gasoline from Nashville to Memphis, you had to get permission from the state to do it. It was a way of, if you start talking about common carriers, it's a foreign language. People don't understand what a difference it used to make to be called a common carrier. But the idea was that the government would get together and guarantee a certain level of return in exchange for the right to regulate the common carriers. And that allowed the traveling public, or in this case, the people that were shipping gasoline, to have some reasonable expectation of what kind of service they would get. And it allowed the people who had the certificate to provide that service a reasonable return on their money. So at that time, if you wanted to haul gasoline, you had to get permission, and you had to bring witnesses in, and they had to testify that they had a need for gasoline to be hauled, and it wasn't being properly served by the existing carriers. And so we would have regular dog and pony shows where we would go all over the state and get together and arrange hearings at various resort motels or wherever. Bring the witnesses in, take good care of them the night before the hearing, but make sure they got to the hearing the next day and testified appropriately. And the lawyers that were involved knew each other. Again, one day my part would be, oh, well, my client will go broke if you let that guy in the market. And the next day I'd be the guy who had to get into the market, and my friends would be saying their clients were going to go broke.
And so, I think you represented some of the biggest sort of haulers of gasoline and liquid goods in the state, didn't you?
I did at that time. It's hard to think about that now because everything's wide open, but the market was dominated at that time by fewer carriers. And if you wanted bulk transportation, liquids in bulk, that mostly was chemicals and gasolines, yeah, I had most of those people. And so if somebody wanted to come before the commission and wanted to get authority, they would basically have to come to my client and say, look, will you oppose me if I just try to do this? So there was a lot of king-making going on by people who weren't necessarily elected.
And if I'm correct, some of the well-known lawyers who practiced with you were people like Mr. Dodson, Jr. from my firm, A.O. Buck, Clarence Evans.
Clarence Evans, yeah. Yeah, in fact, Mr. Dodson obviously is where I got the clients I had.
Yeah.
He turned them over to me.
Tell me what other items or areas you've practiced in as a practitioner.
I've done a fair amount of construction work, and I don't know that necessarily grew from the fact that I dug ditches. It's just that once you get into it and develop some degree of expertise, you know, they're different buildings, but it's all pretty much the same process. And you got a pretty good handle on how things operate. So I did a fair amount of that.
You've represented some short line railroads, I believe.
Well, yes, that's true. I'd forgotten that. I had a good client who had a short line railroad that ran from Nashville to basically to Ashland City. And spent a great deal of time with that. Again, that's sort of the same thing. Common carrier approach, and it was very different from the unregulated environment that we have now, all of which went up in smoke in 1993 or 4, whenever President Clinton deregulated interstate commerce. And once that happened, well, that's true. And part of that I had gotten was Greyhound bus lines, which
right.
Mr. Dodson had also represented. You know, we wanted to, there was another dog and pony show, we wanted to eliminate service to various little towns, and we could, you know, go before the judge and prove that we were losing money every time we had to leave the interstate and go up to Dresden and pick up 2 people and haul them back to the interstate. But it didn't matter because under the old scheme, they guaranteed you'd make enough money off of people going from Nashville to Memphis to offset the cost of going to Dresden. And once you lost that guarantee, Dresden no longer had bus service.
If I recall correctly, you also spent time more recently in your career representing cab services.
That's true, and I don't know that those are necessarily related, but again, they're very similar kind of businesses. You have to prove a demand, and you have to prove the ability to meet the demand. And I had the opportunity. Nashville is growing so fast, and there's so, especially with the new convention center and all the new construction here on the south side of Broadway, the new hotels. Constantly in need of additional transportation for tourists here in town. And I just happened to hit upon it at a time when there was a lot of social change going on too with the way cab companies were operated. The sort of old model is one company would buy up a bunch of permits and then rent them out to individual drivers. And the individual drivers would furnish the car and do all the driving, and they would pay what they call a lick every month for the right to rent that permit to drive that car. And my folks were all drivers. They were immigrants from Somalia, and they saw it's a clan-based society from what I understand, and they saw how members of their family, their extended family, their clan, were being required to pay this lick every month if they were on their back in the hospital bed. And they'd go around and collect money for their members of the group and pay it so that permit would be available when he recovered and got out of the hospital. And they finally said, well, this is ridiculous. We're in America. We just start our own company and we'll run it like cab drivers. And we'll relieve our guys from this lick. And so they weren't the first. Their Ethiopian brothers were the first ones to come up with the model of a cab driver-owned company. But shortly after it came along, we sort of piggybacked on their application. And we had the Somalian-based company. And we're lucky enough to have rights granted. And then within a year or two, they had more than doubled in size. And last I heard, they are continuing to grow and doing very well. So I enjoyed that very much. It was nice, again, to help people who were strangers to the system and who were strangers to the country, but really bought into the American dream. And it was good to be able to help them succeed.
Over the course of your career, are there any cases or trials, Jere, that you wanted to mention or that were outstanding for one reason or another in your mind? Things you'd really enjoyed or were proud of?
Yeah, I think one in particular I remember was my first jury trial. It was, again, with Dodson Harris, we had some pretty nice clients. We represented the Aden Railroad. And my first jury trial was to defend a case in Dixon County against a fellow who claimed that we had set his pine trees on fire. Our train going by apparently was throwing sparks. And we had set his pine trees on fire and paid for them twice previously. So we weren't expecting a good result. And I was assigned to go down there and sort of presented myself to the jury as the sacrificial lamb sent down there by the railroad because they didn't expect to get a fair shake out of a Dixon County jury. But I had a guy who was, I don't know the exact name, I couldn't tell you, arborist or something, a tree specialist. And he had gone down there and he had determined that even if we set the fire, we didn't owe the guy as much for the trees as he was claiming. And he had come up with a figure that he thought was fair if we set the fire. And so we had made an offer and it had been turned down. So we had to go to trial. And the jury came back and said, we find for Mr. Lee. And the judge looked at me and said, well, Mr. Lee, you've not only won your first jury trial, you've won your first judgment, it was Judge Birch, which I've always remembered, and Colonel Hooper, who people may not remember, but he was the face of the Aden Railroad for
Absolutely.
many years. Colonel Hooper was there, and I really felt like I was on the way at that point. So I remember that one, and then tried a case with Mr. Harris, which is the Judy's. People may not remember that, but there was some suggestion that perhaps these executives had gotten together and decided they would rip off the Wendy's concept and sell theirs and only call it Judy's. Mr. Harris ended up defending them, and I got to see him work in front of Judge Morton. I didn't do much of anything, although I do remember Judge Morton saying at one point that he didn't know my name, but he knew that I smiled all the time. I didn't know if that was good or not, coming from Judge Morton.
I don't know either.
But then you and I worked on a case together that was also a lot of fun. A similar sort of franchise case with Winners, right?
Miss Winners Corporation.
Miss Winners.
Yes. Jere, I know that in the last, 15 or 20 years, you have done a lot of work with a particular lawyer and firm in Clarksville. Tell us a little bit about how that developed and how your Roger Manis friendship developed.
That's true. Roger Manis and his firm in Clarksville. We've also become really good friends other than Scott. I'd say I've been hanging out with Roger about as long as anybody. And I guess that started in about 83, 84, something like that. And again, you were part of it. We were defending a fellow up there at Fort Campbell Federal Credit Union, as I recall. And he was a wheeler and dealer, and perhaps had wheeled and dealed a little too much, or at least had managed to rub some people up there the wrong way. And we ended up being involved with Roger because Roger represented him individually, and we represented him on behalf of his carrier, as I recall. Got to working with Roger, and through that, the rest is history. We became best friends, and perhaps more importantly at the center of all of that is hiking buddies. Spent a great deal of time, many cold, miserable nights. Those are the ones always best to tell about in the stories, but a lot of warm, nice nights as well, days out on the trail, and traveling all over the country and seeing a lot of great places. We've been to Yosemite. We've been to Glacier a number of times. We've been to the Grand Canyon. We've been to the Tetons, been to Yellowstone with a bunch of great people and had a great time.
I know that you and I spent some great days at Glacier National Park just climbing mountains and having an awful lot of fun out there.
That's right. Nothing better when the weather cooperates. And when it doesn't, that's part of it.
And of course, then there's that great story about the winter where we took the hike to the top of the Smokies and hit more snow and wind than we expected. And as I recall, you decided when we finally got back to the vehicle that you were going home.
Yeah, that was the death march. There were a number of trips to the Smokies where we hit more snow and wind than we anticipated. And we have bailed out or shortened our trips, but nothing was quite like that. The reason this all got started was to go in the winter, because anybody could go when the weather's nice. But if you really wanted to prove whatever the hell we thought we were going to prove, you needed to go when the conditions were challenging. And on this particular trip, we ended up going, and we were going from Newfound Gap over Dome, and the idea was, I think, to eventually come out somewhere down around Cades Cove. But we quickly learned the first day, we went to Mount Collins, which was about 5 miles or so, and we quickly learned we were going to probably have to cut the trip short. It was snowing. There was probably 6 inches of snow on the ground. The next day we walked out to the road, which we could have taken a left and walked back down to Newfound Gap and flagged a ride and gone home and drank beer and told stories. But some sort of a machine had been up there and had packed the snow down on the road. And that was fool's gold for us. Since we had this nice packed snow, we decided, well, we'll just go on up to Clingman's Dome and see what happens. by the time we got up there to Klingman's Dome, it was about, I don't think it got over 18 that day because I was carrying my water inside my jacket and it was frozen, so you couldn't drink anything. The sun was shining and the wind was howling like crazy. It looked beautiful, but it was awful cold. We tried to break into the restroom there at Klingman's Dome to get out of the wind, and the pipes had burst and water had frozen all over the floor, so we couldn't stay there. And we went on to the next shelter, and by the time we got there, the snow was up to your crotch. You'd step off in a hole, and you'd have to pull your leg out to go take the next step. And you can't imagine how tiring that gets.
Oh, I was there.
Well, you can imagine. And then you got about 30 or 40 pounds on your back in addition to that. Yeah. So we all decided, we didn't take a vote. No one ever discussed it. It was just decided that we were bailing out the next morning first thing. And I don't think, my boots never thawed out that night. So when I got up the next morning, they were frozen solid. I got up and was with my brother, and we hiked a little ways, and then he had to take a break. And I looked at him, and his nose was the color of a cherry. We're seriously in frostbite condition. So we walked all day. We had several wet crossings. My feet were bleeding because my boots were frozen. And when I'd take them off, they'd scrape. So when I'd walk on the snow and leave these red spots, it was real impressive at the time. But we did all of this because one member of our group, who shall remain nameless, had assured us that there was a new bridge at the bottom. And when we got to that new bridge, it would be easy sailing from there. Well, when we got to the bottom, there was no bridge. We ended up having to shinny across an ice-covered log and barely be able to get up on the other side, and then had another couple of miles to go. And I just remember it was just getting dark, and I saw some headlights. And fortunately, some member of the group had gotten down there, caught a ranger just as he was making his last turn for the day. And the ranger had called a friend, and a friend was there with a car to pick us up. But at that point, we had to go back to the cabin we were staying in, and everybody else was all in good spirits and everything. But I had decided that Mother Nature had kicked my ass, and I was going home. And I never let go of the steering wheel.
I remember it well.
Y'all kept coming back out and saying, come on in, we'll get some beer and pizza. No, I'm going home. And I did.
You did.
I made about 80 y'all drive home in a vehicle for 4 people the next day.
Isn't it astounding?
But I was going home.
That the trips you remember the most and most vividly now are the ones where you had really bad.
Well, that's the one that somebody could have been seriously hurt. We were very lucky.
Yeah,
that was as close as I want to come.
We really were. I should mention also, when we're talking about things that you love and enjoy, they're Vanderbilt sports. Tell us a little bit about that.
I forgot about that.
Where did that come from?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Nicole's husband, Tyler, got me interested in Vanderbilt baseball, and since then, we've been season ticket holders and got really good seats, and for years and years went down to the conference tournament at Hoover and have gone to places to see them play. Went to Atlanta one time in the postseason, been to Louisville a couple of times, and have just become big fans. I'm a great admirer of Corbin. I think, unlike today, you don't want to get too far out front and cheer for a kid because the next day you may pick up the paper and find out he's done something awful. And I don't have that worry with Corbin. If they were that kind of kid, he wouldn't have them in his program. Yeah. So you can cheer for somebody like that, and you don't have to worry that someday you're going to be embarrassed by something they do. I enjoyed very much. They won the national championship 2 years ago. They beat the better team, And then last year they played that same team and they lost. And I think we were the better team the year we lost. They were the better team the year they lost, but that's baseball. At least we were able to square it up in 2 years' time.
Do you and Yvonne also go to the basketball games pretty regularly?
We do. We've been season ticket holders ever since we graduated, and typically go. I did not go last night, but we typically go to those games. The stairs are becoming more and more difficult, but other than that, yes. You know, it's like, if you remember, if you've been a Vanderbilt fan as long as I have, you know, you don't worry too much about the football team because there's always basketball. And now we don't have to worry too much about the basketball team because there's always baseball. So, other than three good years with James Franklin, the football team appears to have returned to its old ways.
Just a few other things, Jerry. You mentioned that you weren't able to get sometimes up and down the steps. And I don't think you've been able to go hiking for the last year or so with us. What's the situation there?
Well, in March of 13, I was diagnosed with ALS. And for those who don't know, haven't seen Pride of the Yankees, it's a progressive, fatal disease that attacks the motor neurons, basically the nerves that control your muscles. And once the neurons aren't there to tell the muscles to move, the muscles can't move, and so they just atrophy and die. And it affects different people in different ways. I've been, I guess, lucky in the sense they caught it early and told me what it was. And it started in my fingertips and has worked its way up through my arms and is now beginning to affect my legs. And it affects your breathing, obviously. But there are different varieties of it. It affects different people in different ways. It affects them in some people more quickly than others. So I've been lucky. Unfortunately, I had to tell my kids about it and told them, you know, I'm not interested in any kind of bucket list. Somebody that's got a bucket list seems to me like they feel like their regular life has been somehow holding them down or keeping them from doing things they really want to do. And I don't feel that way at all. I'd like for things to continue just the way they've always been.
Yeah, yeah.
Rather than have some bucket list I want to perform. So,
have you been able to practice for the last, roughly half year?
I did. I practiced up until June of this year, and then the doctor said, you need to retire. And so I did, closed my office as of September 1st. And, you know, you've always got a few details you got to wrap up, but that gave me time to match existing clients with new lawyers and to get permission to withdraw, things like that. I tell you, the hardest thing I've had dealing with is how to tell people.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want to just come out and say, hey, let me tell you my tale of woe. But at the same time, it's natural apparently for lawyers in particular, if they hear you've retired, to come up and to start giving you grief about, well, you got all your money and you're going to be living on the beach and having a good life and everything. And when I hear people say that, I think, you know, when you find out the truth, you're going to feel bad. And so I just got to stop them and say, no, it's not like that at all. And I really do that because I don't want them to feel bad later on when they find out.
Exactly. And I remember, you know, that you were kind enough to take me aside early on and tell me, and even though it was news I didn't want to hear, I really appreciated your telling me about it.
Well, I felt like I owed it to you and Scott, and you guys in particular have been so kind to me over the last 2 years when we found out about it to continue to arrange these trips so that I can go. You know, I know that it sometimes holds you guys back and you don't get to do things that you would otherwise be doing. but it's really nice of you to alter your schedule and your time away from the office.
I think the whole group of backpackers, Jerry, tell you the truth, just feel that having you along is part of it's an important part of the group, so don't worry about that at all. Let's sort of take a few minutes, and then we're going to finish by letting me ask you some questions overall about law practice and your experience. How has practice changed over your career? What ways are significant to you? Anything that comes to mind?
I don't claim to have the answer to that. All I can say is in the last few years when I was practicing, I would make an effort, because there was nearly always a younger lawyer on the other side, nearly always make an effort to say, well, before we do anything, let's go eat lunch. And let's go talk about stuff other than the case. Tell me about you. Tell me about your family. Tell me about what you like to do. Tell me what you don't like to do. You know, so that we can be human beings and have a level that we can relate to each other on, other than yelling and screaming and pointing fingers. And I think it makes it harder to yell and scream and point fingers if you know somebody on that level. Yep. So that was an effort always, and it always amazed me. Everybody would be shocked. They'd say, well, why? Or suspicious. It's, what you going to poison my food or what? I said, no, I just like to get to know you, you know. So maybe that's been lost. Maybe it's not as much a fraternity as it once was. The collegiality has been lost, and it plays into my narrative of so many things. But it's like, you know, people should be more interested in enjoying what they do rather than profiting from what they do.
Are there any courts or judges that you have particularly enjoyed appearing before?
No. I don't remember anyone in particular that I didn't get along with or that seemed to favor me in any way. I remember a lot of the ones that I had fondly. Chancellor Brandt. I liked a lot of things he did. Names are escaped. Chancellor High. I liked a lot of things he did. Kilcrease. I liked a lot of things he did. It's just sort of the way you run your courtroom, you know. But again, there wasn't someone in particular that I didn't get along with. Or I guess I've never been one who's much into the idea that as a judge you've got to try to intimidate the lawyers or intimidate the litigants. I mean, that's not the purpose for which you're there. And those that have everybody scared to speak or scared to move, or I just don't think that's what it should be about. It's supposed to be about solving problems.
From your experience in a number of decades of private practice alone as a sole practitioner, what advice would you give a young lawyer thinking about going into sole practice?
I have some clients with him before he strikes out on his own, if at all possible. If that means going to work for a firm and developing not only experience but some relationships, but I've never considered myself to be an entrepreneur, but I will confess the first 6 months or so when you look back and say, well, damn, I made it. I did it. I wasn't sure I'd be able to pay the bills at the end of the month, and I've been able to make enough to do that. That was a very satisfying feeling. But frankly, you quickly, at least in my case, felt like I quickly lost the time to take satisfaction out of that and was more concerned about how was I going to do it again next month. And so if you have a good steady stream of clients, it makes everything a lot easier. I mean, that's sort of like saying, how do you want to have a good life? Well, start off having good parents, you know. We don't have a lot of control over that, but it is a pretty substantial factor.
You know, I know from being a close friend of yours that you take a lot of interest in the social context of the country, the changes that are taking place in the country. How do you think the bench and the bar have done over your years of practice in meeting the challenges of social change? What's your gauge on that?
Well, I think in many ways the judiciary is set up to be a conservative institution, the legal profession. You know, if you want change, I think change is typically going to come through the legislative process. I think the judiciary is more to make sure that whatever the existing law is enforced, and it's not designed to change the law. Although I'm sure there are those who claim that there are too many judges that do that. And I suppose I would have to acknowledge there are some decisions that some judges have made that were making law, and I nevertheless approved of it. But I really don't think that's the function of the judiciary. Or, you know, obviously lawyers need to be out there pressing the envelope on behalf of existing law, but it's supposed to be an incremental change. There aren't supposed to be any great leaps forward. It's supposed to be case by case. And I just think if you really want any kind of radical change or sweeping change, that's supposed to come from the legislature. It's not supposed to come from the law. Not supposed to come from the judiciary.
If you were talking to your grandchild or someone getting ready to go to college or considering a career, what would you tell them about law practice?
Well, you know, there's no better feeling in the world than when a jury comes back and rules in your favor. When you have spent time and treasure building on a blank slate and filled in that slate with the information that you think will be most influential, and when they buy it and come back and side with you, there's no better feeling in the world. But I'm still not convinced it's worth all the heartache to get there. I think what I would tell them is, and I never thought I would say this, but the people that said, I wanted to go to law school not because I want to practice law, I just want the experience. My God, why would you go through that unless you really wanted to do it? But to the extent that law school teaches you to try to see things from somebody else's perspective and to try to think like they do, even if the purpose for making that effort is to deconstruct what they're doing, everybody's got to be better off if they have a better ability to understand why other people think the way they think. That's got to help everybody in the long run. So to the extent law school does that for you, I'm all for it.
Jere, this has been a pleasure and it's been fascinating. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to your oral history that we haven't covered?
No, I really don't think of anything. Can't think of anything. I
Well,
appreciate having the opportunity to do this with you in particular. It made it a lot easier than if it had been just anyone else, and hopefully it made it more meaningful.
Well, it's been an honor for me, and thank you very much.
Sure.